Faith and Culture Now podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Shiffer, and today I'm here with Jillian and
Hello.
Steve. So, how are you guys?
Doing
Doing
good.
great.
Good. This is the first podcast for Faith and Culture Now for the new season. And today we're going to be talking about the idea of whether or not there's anything new under the sun. And we've done podcasts now for a number of years, but we took the year 2025 off. And before 26 has started, when we left the original podcast, there was a lot of political unrest and there was stuff happening in Ukraine and there was stuff happening in Iran. And we've taken a whole year off, and guess what? There's still political unrest. There's still stuff happening in Iran. There's still stuff happening in the Ukraine. And essentially, we're left asking, is there really anything new, or is it just the same old all the time? And so I wanted to begin the podcast today by just talking about what kind of words of wisdom you might have for someone who's wondering, is it ever going to end? Is it going to get better? How does life change over time? And, obviously we want to, always frame everything in a Christian perspective or from a biblical worldview. But Steve, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think obviously from a biblical worldview, my thought is God has created reality, and much like Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And that's not necessarily like a bad thing. I think oftentimes that's framed from like a negative perspective of the same old boring life. That's not my perspective, but I think some people can see it that way. I like to think of, like, from a biblical worldview, I like to think of like God has created reality in such a way that we can trust life, right? We can trust the reality. I can learn about how to live by studying history. There's no new matter or energy that God's creating. There's no new powers or authorities. God's established the power and authority system as is. That doesn't mean every authority is accurate or right, but this is the structure that he's created. There's no new patterns of human behavior. There's no new wisdom like The Secret or the law of attraction. And because of that, I can trust and lean into the scriptures as a reliable source of how to live my life day in and day out. I can study history and recognize these are the patterns of behavior. And I don't have to worry about, is there something I've not seen, something that I need to go find? Almost like a Gnostic perspective, right? Like, I need to go learn something that's been unlearned in order to further evolve us or whatever. And so I actually find this to be a beneficial worldview outlook and like a healthy humility, I guess.
Yeah, very good. Jillian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with you talking about patterns. That was kind of the thing I was also contemplating and thinking about this, that there's a comfort in patterns. And yes, every new civilization, every new age, every new culture that arises, there's going to be some form of newness to those kinds of things. But I'm teaching music appreciation this year for the first time. And we're actually doing world music this quarter, which is fun because I get to learn all of this before I teach it to the kids. So, I mean, of course, I know some of these things, but we're learning about all of these cultures, like Japanese culture and mariachi bands. And it's interesting because as I'm learning it and teaching the kids, we're finding patterns that are similar. That's one of the things they do as an assignment, is what is similar across all the cultures. Yes, there's differences. There's different instruments. There's different kinds of things. But generally, what I find fun about their current unit, it's called music of spectacle. And this idea that all cultures have spectacles. They have celebrations. They have parties and events that they like to celebrate through music with. And so that's just been on my mind the last couple of weeks in this topic that we're looking at. But like you said, with human behavior too, I think with all the heavy things going on right now, particularly in our country, but as across the world, it's so easy to think, to be laser focused on our time and our era and think this has just never happened before. It's never been like this. It's never been this bad. And, all I have to do is talk to my parents. They say, sure it has. It was absolutely this bad. Like, you just weren't alive yet. And then you read the Bible, and I'm going through Exodus with some students right now. And holy cow. I mean, literally, there was all kinds of things going on for centuries that were
Yeah.
not only as bad, but far, far worse than what we're encountering right now. So humility is the other word, Steve, I liked you brought up, because I think the Bible both gives us the historical perspective and the humility to acknowledge that God's in control of all of it and he's got this. There's just never been a time that surprised God and caught him off guard and he wasn't able to carry his people through. Not only that, but he stands outside of time. So he knows there's a purpose being worked out. Whether that's, I'm not saying that he wants the things to happen that are always happening, but there is a purpose unfolding. And that's much easier to see, hindsight is 2020. But when you're living in it, I think being people of faith, being Christian, that is a piece that we have, that this has all
Yeah.
worked out in every era.
Absolutely. It's important for Christians to trust God and to remember that it's not that God just keeps us from harm or keeps us out of every problem that arises in the world, but rather that God is beside us and with us as we go throughout the world, including during the times in which we face problems and face trials or tribulation or persecution or whatever the case may be. And so you look at what's happening, say, in Iran right now with the people revolting against the, uh, I would say, hijacked government that took place in 1979 that's still in power. And, the people haven't had the opportunity or ability to really come back into power of their own until now. And we're still not sure what the result of this is going to be. And people are willing to die for that freedom. And not only is that an important thing to, just to conceptually think about, but to recognize that God is aware of what's happening there. And you could argue that he is standing with the people who are standing up to the oppression and the things that have been happening in their country. And obviously there's a lot of, potentially nuance there, but in any situation where there's great evil, you can find God in the midst of the people who are suffering. And you can also find, I think, when you look at scripture, God's heart for those who are in those kinds of situations. And so we obviously, as we look at, anything new under the sun, while certain patterns keep happening and certain things in life are just normal as they are, we need to not lose sight of the fact that even the normal mundane things are orchestrated in God's plan for creation and for what he's called us to be and to do. So God created us to work, created us to have community. God created us to live in community with others around us, contributing to the betterment of everyone. That's part of his plan in the garden, and it may seem mundane and non-essential, but in fact, it has eternal significance because that's part of who God created us to be and what he created us to do as his stewards of this world.
Yeah, and I think that's when you frame your existence that way, then going to work every day, kind of the you got a case of the Mondays, I think that can creep up on anybody. But when you're framing your worldview in such a way that, hey, this is how God created us, and I can find joy and meaning in the day-to-day activities, I work an 8 to 5 job and I can get frustrated with that, but I also recognize a higher purpose. Jillian, you were saying God has a meaning in a purpose in everything, not to say that he's driving all of I don't have a theology that says God is behind or creating the evil, the sin in the world, but I do believe that he has a purpose in it. And so I can trust that as I'm doing day-to-day activities that I'm hopefully bringing honor to him. And I can also recognize that what's going on in Iran or any other country, that God is in control and that he has people there that he's using. And instead of feeling like there's no purposes to this world, I can trust that he's involved somehow, some way beyond my understanding. I can rest in that.
Yeah. So when we don't have it all figured out, which we oftentimes do not have it all figured out, we can rest knowing that, hey, look, I don't have to know it all because the creator of the universe knows it all. He understands. And again, He's with us in the good and the bad times. So when I invited you guys to the podcast tonight, I sent in a video for you guys to watch on musical interpolation. And when I was thinking about, is there anything new under the sun? I've started noticing more and more and more in songs on the radio, whether they be contemporary Christian music, country music, pop music, even rock music. I'm hearing bits and pieces of songs that I think, that's not original to this. I've heard that before. And so I'll put the video link under our podcast for anybody that watches it on YouTube. You can click on that and see what we're talking about. But interpolation is a way of sort of getting around paying copyright royalties to previous songwriters and musicians. But it's also a way of putting something familiar into something new so that it will be more eye-catching or ear-catching in the sense of music and seem a little bit more familiar in such a way that people may not even recognize all the time they're listening to something they've heard before, but because they instinctively liked the thing before, they're more inclined to like the new thing now. So,
Right.
Jillian, what are some of your thoughts on musical interpolation and how that speaks to just culture and the way that we love and enjoy music, but also how it speaks to maybe art and creativity in the world today?
Well, when this happens with new music, it makes me feel crazy. Like, I think I know this song, and I start singing it, and it's not that song. And so I thought, oh, yeah. And especially there was an Ed Sheeran song that I think was referenced there that one of my kids loves Ed Sheeran, and we listen to a lot. But then that actually drove me to then go look up how many lawsuits have been filed over copyright issues. It's a lot. It's a lot. Some got dismissed or whatever, but that was a fun read. And, I can kind of see it both ways because there have been a few of those cases that when it happened, I would go on the deep dive rabbit hole as to, how do you really parse that out? Because of what we're saying, that there is nothing new under the sun. There is only so much music out there. And because music does have a boundary around it, because there are only so many pitches and chords and things like that, and especially if we're talking about popular music that's not going to be modal, I won't nerd out on all that, but there's only so much that you can at some point over thousands of years do. Of course, we've only had recorded music for, 100 something years. But so, I mean, as time goes on, my college friends, we used to have this conversation of like, what's the future of music going to be like? Because this is going to happen. And now with AI, it's going to be very interesting. But I think lyrics probably get even more personal for people when that is something that's been repackaged or used. I don't know. Steve might have other thoughts on that too. But I don't know. I think that it's a difficult time that we're in right now as a musician if you want to compose because you're combating like the AI situation that lots of people are starting to use, and it's fun. I mean, it's easy. It's not great, and that's a whole other conversation. That's a whole other podcast, but it's not as creative. And I think I can tell when something is being fed to us by AI versus not, because there's just a soullessness to it
Yeah.
that does not quite land the way that it does when you know it is coming out of somebody's actual heart and experience. So I don't know. I'm interested as somebody that's, midlife, those of us that have spanned this weird time in history to be before all of the computer generated stuff. And now we have it. And it's just fascinating to see, is there going to be anything new or are they? Well, and even as somebody, I'm a huge musical theater fan. And of course I love when they do revivals and things like that, or, some of the movies they turn in, but I long for something new. I want to see somebody write a new musical with new story. It's just not very often anymore. And so I guess that makes me sad. Like there's a creativity that's not being encouraged in some way. And of course, as a music educator, I take that seriously. Like, what are we not doing to
Yeah.
encourage people down that path?
I think about the number of really great guitar players there were in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and the lack of a number of really great, well-known guitar players who have started. And they're older guys and girls who have been around for 30 years still playing, but you don't have a lot of 20-year-olds that are famous guitar players. And there's a handful, but not like there was in years past. I feel like with a lot of the AI, and not just AI, but electronics in general, it's made it easier for people to be lazier about the musical with their musical abilities and skills, with what they can play, what they can do, but also it's made it easier for them to utilize other tools to clean things up and make things sound differently without having to actually be able to do it themselves. I find that to be, in a way, I think it speaks to a lack of creativity. So, what you mentioned, Jillian, was, man, I want a brand new, musical to come out that is completely fresh. But when you look at Hollywood, you don't have that either. But before we get there, Steve, you are also a musician. And so, for some of our
Yeah.
listeners who may not know, you were actually in a Christian punk band. And so,
Mhm.
what are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so first off, not to try to correct you, Scott, but Tim Henson from Polyphia is a fantastic young guitarist. And the very first thing you should do when you get off of this podcast is go pull up Tim Henson. He is so good that a lot of people are saying he's like too good, that it's too perfect, and that he's so good that he's like not good. You know what I mean? Kind
Hmm,
of like what they say
interesting.
about like Les Claypool of like he's so good that he's not good. But yeah, go check out Tim Henson. He's like,
Yeah.
if you're a guitar fan, he's somebody that you can watch and go, oh, this dude's doing something different than what other guitarists have done historically. But as far as like music goes and interpolation, I understand. So I guess I have two perspectives. So there's like a legal perspective. And then there's like an artistic perspective. So the legal perspective, I think, I'm going to let the lawyers figure all that stuff out. I get why there's like rights and, who owns the songs themselves, and that's like a thing. I don't have to worry about that because I don't really make millions of dollars on my music. When I get to that point, we'll argue something else, right? But right now, it's not really something I care too much about. The lawyers are figuring that out, and Jillian, like you said, there's so many cases that go to court. And so I'm just I don't care about that side. From an artistic perspective, I grew up in like the early hip hop era where they're sampling music constantly, right? So like I love Ill Communication by Beastie Boys, and so much of that record is just like old jazz loops that they just have going in the background, but they created like a brand new song using those old samples, and it's like vinyl samples, right? This is before you have Fruity Loops, all these like digital effects that you can create loops and stuff. And so for me, I have that perspective of I'm not concerned about this song sounds like that. I mean, a lot of times I'm cool with you trying to write a song that sounds like another song. I remember one of my favorite ska bands, the Specials, they had like one of their songs had the Munsters theme like song was in one of their songs because they're trying to get you to think about kind of the dark but also silly side of life. And so for me, like that kind of stuff is just ingrained in how I write music. I'm not against leaning into that as long as I'm not just like covering a song. Like to me, it's about creating something new. That doesn't mean that I can't lean into something that has already been done. In fact, I don't think there's a way to do that, especially in like American music. It's pretty much, like G, C, A minor, D, right? That's
Right.
basically it. And then, if you play guitar, you just put the capo up and down the neck, and those are your songs, right? And so you could say that you're stealing from the Beatles if you want to argue that, and okay, fine. If that's the criticism, so be it. But from an artistic perspective, I'm down with leaning into that. And then from like a Christian perspective, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but a lot of our hymns that I grew up singing were just like bar songs that they put like Christian lyrics to because it was like a melody that people were familiar with, and so they come to church, and we can find a way to kind of get people involved, and there's like a whole history that we could dig into there that probably takes us away from the point being that there's a history of humanity kind of doing this, kind of, leaning into these songs and stuff, and you create something new and something unique. And then lastly, from an artistic perspective, I know I'm going on a rant, but I have thoughts. Lastly, I would say if you don't like it, don't, don't enjoy it. Like, don't play that song. If that's something that bugs you, then just don't listen to that artist. It doesn't have to be something that, like, I see people can get really worked up over this, and I don't really understand why. Like, artistically, if that's not, if you don't like it, then just don't participate. So that's kind of my thought. Like, I'm not hostile towards it. In fact, I think that when done right, whether it's paintings or like Andy Warhol, right? Like, was Andy Warhol stealing from Campbell's Soup when he was, putting a Campbell's Soup I mean, it's not, I don't want that on my wall, but I see what he's doing. He's making a statement, right? Like the Marilyn Monroe picture that he just overexposed and put, 100 of them on one canvas. What was the point, right? You could argue, well, you didn't take that picture, right? That's not really your art, but he's saying something bigger, that this person who's bigger than life, Marilyn Monroe, was overexposed literally to the world, to her death, right? Like, to her detriment.
Yep.
And this woman that we find beautiful is also exploited. And so I think there's something that we can learn and say artistically that we could too easily just say, oh, I don't want to be a part of that. You're stealing somebody's art. Go away.
Yeah. So, it makes me think of the Beatles, right? You mentioned, people could try to, copy their songs now, but when the Beatles started, they were primarily covering country songs and blues songs
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
30s and the 40s and some into the 50s, but mostly the 30s and the 40s. And as they got popular, I mean, they were always putting other people's songs on their early albums because they liked them and they wanted to honor those people by playing their stuff. And they were writing their own songs too. But then you think of guys like Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson does songs every single year still that are covers of other people's songs. And I've heard him in interviews say, I like doing covers. It's fun for me. They're songs I like. I want to play them. And so I don't have a problem with that. But I think it's also important to know that guys like the Beatles and Willie Nelson are trying to honor people from the past. And I think what I want to see more of with interpolation is giving honor to the things that have gone before. And so uh, I think that when you're going to interpolate someone else's song purposely or on accident, if it's pointed out to you, hey, this is really similar to this, I think you have a responsibility as an artist to say, hey, I recognize and learned or whatever that this is coming from this over here, and you should check that out too. Here's my new song. And as long as we're giving credit, I think that there's really no problem with it. But I think we also want to be, about that. So sort of turning our attention to Hollywood, right now Disney is working on a live Tangled. They've also, I think, just about got live Moana done. And over the last several years, we've seen them do live versions of many of their animated films. And it asks, causes us again to ask the question, is there anything new in Hollywood? And how do we deal with that from, an artistic perspective, but even as a consumer? You hear people say, oh, the theater's dead, and then something will come out and it'll make billions of dollars in the theater, millions and millions, close to, over $1 billion, right? If it's something that people are really interested in or invested in. But then you have a lot more flops. And, some might argue, well, that's because we've got lazy writing, or it's because it's just a bunch of rehashed stuff that we've already seen. And so what are some of y'all's thoughts on artistic creativity, say, in Hollywood?
Well, either rehashing or just continuing to make a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth and a seventh, which is
Yeah.
fine.
And
But
then lots of prequels, right?
and then prequels, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm always more interested in those, actually. But then it's like you gotta go read the book of that before you can go see the film. But yes, I don't know why there's such a lack of new material. I don't know if I have ideas of why, and I do think, like you said earlier, there's just a general laziness of culture-wide, general laziness of I don't want to do hard things. I just think that's sort of the state of the younger half of our country right now. Like I said, we're all kind of like in between the two halves, or at least I feel like I am in between the two halves, so I can kind of see both things happening. But I do think that's probably the number one culprit is just when you think about back in the 40s, back in the 30s, even back in the 60s, as I watch some shows that are taking place during those time periods, the cell phone is just such a distraction. It just is. And I think that for all of the good the internet has brought us and broadened our horizons, and we get to see and do all kinds of things we couldn't do before. So that's a plus. But it has also just really stolen time from all of us. And I don't say necessarily even laziness, like I'm trying to beat us all up. I'm not saying that. It is the general state of things. And so it's going to take effort, conscious effort, to get out of that. Whereas, not that there were just, millions and millions of prolific artists back then, but there were more because that's what they were doing with their time. And that's not what we're doing with our time now. So, it's like when a great movie lands, like you just said, it really lands now because when I was in junior high, it was the age of like Titanic and Pearl Harbor and all the Independence Day films and like these big, huge spectacles of films. And of course, finances are a big part of the reason, and COVID and whatever, all that. But also, I just think the imagination has been completely sucked out of a lot of our creativity because we don't imagine things anymore. We just scroll and look at
I
them.
would argue that more people are consumers than contributors. And I think when we were younger, we didn't have as many resources at our fingertips to consume as much. Right? At the same time, that doesn't mean that everybody was super creative and, but it seems like in general, there were more creative types because they, like you said, had the time and the energy to put into that. Whereas today, it's a lot easier just to say, I'm going to see what this guy did or on my phone, right? I think it's also caused our attention span to significantly decrease. And so you can flip through and watch 10 videos on 10 different things in about 7 minutes. And it's a commitment to sit down for a 2.5 hour movie or even to listen to a 45-minute record. And so that's, something else to think about is it's easier to consume, but it's also easier to consume things in smaller bites, in smaller chunks. And, we know that from research that a lot of these, YouTube videos, TikTok videos, whatever, they tend to give little dopamine hits. And so people get used to getting those dopamine hits. And I think that also contributes. Again, I'm not saying that it's wrong to watch or do anything, but I think we do need to, mindfully go, what are the limits I should have on this? If you're not careful, you spent 3 hours on TikTok scrolling through stuff. And it could be that you say, you know what, I'm going to give myself an hour limit, per day of TikTok so that I'm not, or YouTube or whatever, right? So that you're not just overdoing it on one of these platforms to the point that it becomes a detriment to other things that you should also be spending time on. But Steve, what are some of your thoughts on kind of the Hollywood perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the Hollywood perspective, especially like Disney's such a great example of the nothing new under the sun. And I have an idea that there's something bigger with Disney. I think as they are remaking these movies just over and over and over again, it's no longer about the movie itself. It's about creating and sustaining like Disney World, and the toys. These characters are established, and if they can keep them relevant to newer and newer generations, then they don't have to worry about creating new characters, and you don't have to worry about creating something like The Emperor's New Groove, which is by and far the best Disney movie ever.
But
You're
they
not
have it
going to beat
on
that.
live for some reason, they
Yeah,
need
oh
to.
yeah, please don't. Please don't. Yeah, but I think there's probably a more of a business plan going on there where they're just saying this just makes sense for us as a big powerhouse Disney who's more concerned about the brand and the streaming service and Disney World and toys and that kind of thing. So I think
Mhm.
the big movie screen is probably not a big factor for them. They know little kids will come out to the movies. So they're going to come out with a live action Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast and Moana, and parents are going to take their kids. What I do think is happening from an artistic perspective is by them siloing themselves out to this market, which is they're free to do. It's opening up a space for real artists to kind of dig in and create new great art. Now, I'm not sure that it's something that's going to be that this new art these new movies and new shows are going to be palatable to everybody. I'm not sure that they're going to be far reaching, but our family has been really enjoying like what's The Promised Land, which is like a YouTube TV show. It's like they put it on YouTube and now it's been picked up by Angel. It's like an Office style Moses and the Israelites leaving Egypt. Literally has me like cracking up. It's amazing. They are self-funded, or I think they like picked up funding from different investors. And then like, you know, you have The Chosen, and my kids love Wing Feather, and I personally have been like eating up Fallout. I love that. And so I think we're seeing creativity coming from all over what about like the House of David? What like an amazing
Mhm.
dramatic, you know, epic of a show where I think a lot of people just are not catching it. They don't realize that it's really good art that you can find anywhere, right? Like if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch House of David. If you can
Mhm.
log in to YouTube, you can watch, you know, The Promised Land. And so I think there's great art out there. And when you have Disney just kind of focusing on their side, you know, their corner of the field, that leaves the rest of the field open for great artists to be doing stuff. But I think we have to tune our eyes to it, to where back in the day, you just go to the theater and whatever's playing, hopefully it's,
Yeah.
you know, James Cameron or Christopher Nolan movie, and you could find something decent. Nowadays, I think you kind of have to hunt and peck and maybe
Mhm.
do a quick search or ask a friend. But I actually think that there's better art out there that's more approachable. But I think you have to kind of search for it, kind of like Spotify with music, right? Like,
Mhm.
yeah, you can go listen to, I don't know, Lady Gaga, or you can go find some underground punk band who's doing amazing stuff that you've never heard of, but you kind of have to dig for it. You know what I mean?
Right. There's a bit of a joy to the hunt and to finding the good things.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
you know, you guys know I'm a toy guy. I'm kind of a geek that way. And something you were mentioning, Steve, is about Disney being business minded. Well, a lot of the toy companies have to produce toy characters ever so many years, or they could end up losing the rights to use the names of those toys. With G.I. Joe, there was a while Hasbro wasn't renewing the names of the characters, and there was another army toy company that came out that said, we're going to just snag all these names. So now this other toy company is creating army characters with the same names as some of the old GI Joes because Hasbro lost them, you know.
That's amazing. Wow.
But to your point, like with Toy Story type characters, right?
Mhm.
They put toys out of those. And, if you go too many years without putting out a Buzz Lightyear toy, you might lose the rights to it. And now, again, I don't think that's, I mean, there's obviously a lot more to it than that. But the point is that to keep it relevant, you got to keep rehashing that same kind of stuff. And the toy companies know it, the movie companies know it, and the movie companies that also happen to have theme parks and cruise ships and everything else knows it as well. This all kind of makes me think of, also the changing in format of how a lot of art is presented and put out there. With streaming services nowadays, you don't typically, I mean, when I was a kid, if you missed a show on Saturday, you just didn't see that
Yeah.
episode. Like
Yeah.
you couldn't DVR it, you couldn't do anything, right? And, even 15 years ago, people could just, I'll just record that and watch it when I get home. But, I mean, you could do that in the 80s if you were really good with your VCR and you had the timing on it right and everything else. But, I mean, let's face it, it didn't work out for most of us most of the time when we tried to do that. Nowadays, you release an entire series all at once, and then people can determine how quickly they want to binge watch it or spread it out. And so I think the way that we present materials too allows for some shows that would have been an okay movie to be a much better show because you have more time and more ability to do character development and plot thickening and all that kind of stuff that comes along with it. And so you got some really great opportunities with shows there, but then you also have a lot of movies that go straight to streaming now too. And it's interesting that, this year I think K-pop Demon Hunters has been more or less one of the biggest films of the year, and it didn't even go to the theater. At least not that I'm aware of. I think it went straight to Netflix, right? And so you have something that came out that was easily consumable by kids that became a huge cultural phenomenon. And it didn't even take the traditional route of put it in the theater and then make people wait 3 months to buy it on,
Yeah.
DVD. And then it gets the world premiere on, such and such channel. And all that's kind of a thing of the past. And so, while in some respects there's nothing new under the sun, the way that we present things that we've always been presenting and doing continually shifts and changes and is modified. Theater today often comes in the form of movies and television shows. There's still traditional theater where you can go and watch people on stage and whatnot, but people acting out stories has always been a part of human culture and human tradition. And so, even when the method of something changes, there's always something at the heart of it that goes back to the way things have always been. So,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I find that again, I find that just to be, it just makes me feel comfortable. You know what I mean? Like I just recognize these are the patterns of humanity. You can kind of recognize it as it's happening, and you can, it kind of teaches you how to engage with that stuff, right? Like so when it comes to like art or a movie or binging a show, I recognize that I need to be cautious of how much and how often I consume of that thing, and that I balance out the art that I'm consuming with God honoring art, right? Like I love Terminator, right? I love Predator, I love Fallout, but man, if that's all I consume, that's going to create a worldview in me that's, not God honoring. And so I need to balance that out. And if there's ever a new type of way to tell stories that comes about, I need to be cautious of that as well, because in the end, what is it? It's humans telling stories because that's what humans do. Like you said, there's nothing new under the sun. And I love how God initiates that. So he starts Ecclesiastes off by essentially, there's a bunch of pieces of wisdom that he gives. Part of that in Ecclesiastes 1:9, he says, that which has been is what will be, that which is done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. So he starts off Ecclesiastes kind of setting that stage, and then he ends it in Ecclesiastes 12:13-14, and he sums up this teaching by saying, conclusion of the whole matter, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And so I think it'd be so easy to fall into the, oh no, there's nothing new, life is meaningless, or that Hebrew word hevel, which really just means like fleeting, not so much
Yeah.
meaningless, not like a nihilistic, but like a fleeting. And yet, even though life, there's nothing really new under the sun, and life really is fleeting, in the end, the purpose of it all is to fear God, keep his commandments, have a relationship with him, trust him, lean into him. And again, that's what brings me hope. That's what helps me recognize I can trust this creation that I'm living within, right? When it says there's nothing new under the sun, it's talking about the creation that we live within. And so what's the paradigm? I think the paradigm is trusting God, right? Like just kind of bringing it back to what we said at the very beginning. This is his creation, and we can trust that what he's called us to is good. And his creation is good. And if I'm serving him, even if I don't know what he's doing, or I'm confused, or I feel lost, I can still lean in him and into him and trust him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of, the book of Ecclesiastes does talk a little bit about, the meaninglessness, but it doesn't really end there. But I think the reason it doesn't end there is because the author recognizes that even though life is fleeting, life is short, it matters. It's
Yeah.
important. And the God who created the universe finds you as someone with value, intrinsic value, someone with worth, and, finds your life meaningful. He finds the life of every person meaningful, right? And so, to that end, I wanted to kind of end today's podcast by saying, okay, we're parents, we work with churches, or, we're part of the church. And so the question is, when it comes to, instilling values in our congregations, or instilling values, in our youth group or our college group, or instilling values in our own kids, what are some things that we should take away from the idea of nothing new under the sun, but there still being new things out there? How do we help the people that are in our sphere to know how to properly engage culture, how to properly think about what they're going to watch or what they're going to listen to in a way that brings God honor, but also helps them to, I think, make sense out of the world that we live in. So, Jillian, what are some of your thoughts?
I think one thing that can be useful in reminders, this is also going back to the Hollywood talk, but I was just thinking about the biggest movie that's supposed to come out this summer is The Odyssey, right? And so yet another ancient tale that comes back and comes back and comes back and comes back because it says some things that are true about humanity, right? And so I think one of the things we can encourage, particularly young people, but ourselves also, people our own age, is to continue to remember the classics. You know, there are wonderful pieces of all kinds of art that we should not forget about. Matt and I just went to Paris before Christmas and went and walked through the museums. And, you know, it was just a really nice time to just sit and observe in awe all of this creative work that was done over centuries. And so I think while obviously I am somebody who loves to create things and do new things and encourage kids to do new things, I think it's also important for us to not lose sight of there have been marvelous works of art
Mhm.
that it's very easy in our day and age to not have the humility to go back and marinate over and take the time to learn. And so I think that's a really important, it's a really, and I say that because I'm listen to a podcast regularly about choir music. And there's this debate going on in choral music right now, especially dealing with young people of should we just not even teach classical music anymore at all?
Mm.
And I think that's such a shame because the answer is no. You should still do it. Sorry. If you're wondering,
Yeah, yeah.
the answer, you should still teach the class because there are things, first of all, again, I just keep going back to the word humility. You wouldn't have what you have without all of that. And
Yeah.
so I just think there's an arrogance to thinking that you can step onto the world stage as it is in 2026 and start doing all this stuff without understanding the very complex history of how we got here. And that goes for every facet of life. Of course, that goes for our faith more than anything. And so the Bible has to always be the foundation of how we are doing our theology. Because there again, it's going to be so easy to get sound bites and TikTok videos. And I won't go off on that, but we need to still encourage ourselves and our young people to read the Bible, to read
Yeah.
it. And I know that sounds crazy to say that, like that's just duh, but it's not. And even just, I don't know if people outside of education understand the dire straits that reading is in. It's very bad. And anything we can do to keep young people reading the Bible is extremely valuable. And probably the most valuable thing as people who are mentors of any sort of young people in the church, out of the church. Reading in general is so important because these things that we're talking about all in some way go back to reading. And that's just as an educator, it is something that truly worries me in
Mhm.
general. So I think that's probably my biggest hope for all of us is that we are, and myself included, I'm challenging myself in that way. And then also just to create. That's my encouragement.
Yeah, that's
Be
great.
creative. Like whatever it is
Yeah.
that means to you means different things to all kinds of people. But swap out an hour of scrolling for an hour. Like I just over Christmas, one of the things I do is cross stitch like a little old granny. And is it good? No. But it's like, or do a puzzle or like
Yeah.
something, you know, that's just not being on my phone because I'm just
Mhm.
as guilty anybody else that is the natural, it's just a habit. And so I just encourage anybody to take 1 hour of your week, that's it, and do something that's creative instead of that. And I think it's like creativity begets creativity.
Mhm.
And then all
Mhm.
of a sudden, oh, maybe I want to like write a little song, or maybe I want to go cook something. Or so I
Right.
think that God's gift to us as human beings is creativity. And so it's a way to worship, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's my last 2 cents.
God created human beings in his image, but God himself is creative, who created
Yeah.
the earth and the heavens and everything in it, right? And when we are creative, we are reflecting the image of God in humanity. And so it is important to create. You know, I've got one kid who loves to bake. I've got one kid who loves to draw. I've got another kid who wants to figure out how to do different kind of dances and things, whatever they want, you know. It's good to be creative, and to your point, I think it is good for us to put the phone down or turn the TV off and to go do something that allows us to express our own creativity in a way that it's good for nourishing the heart and the soul. To your point on the classics, one of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs is When the Levee Breaks. That's a cover song from a song called The Levee's Going to Break from the 1920s. It was a blues song. And, you look at, again, like the Beatles, everybody else, all these artists who are really famous now. I mean, not Led Zeppelin now, but other artists are, around today. And they all have a good working knowledge of the music that's come
Yeah.
before them. And that may lead to interpolation, but I think it also propels their own creativity forward. And so knowing the classics is important. You mentioned the Odyssey coming out this year as a big, expected movie. When the Odyssey was written as a philosophical work to make sense out of the world that we live in. And if you look at the ancient works of most philosophers, you look at, the stories of, Zeus and all that stuff, and you go, okay, it's ridiculous. How can people think that way? But at the same time, you had these people writing this stuff who are trying to provide answers to some of life's biggest questions. And as Christians, we believe the Bible is the book that contains the answers to life's biggest questions. And as a result, we do need to continue reading the Bible. Reading the Bible is so important. And not just reading it, but reading it to learn the message. Bruce Waltke wrote a book called Knowing God's Will, a Pagan Notion. And Waltke was an Old Testament scholar, and he wrote a really good commentary, co-wrote a good commentary on the book of Genesis. But Waltke's book essentially argues that you don't always have to try to figure out what God's will is in every situation. Instead, what you need to do is figure out what God's will is in general for your existence, right? And a lot of that can be found in the person and the life of Christ and how he lived, and then emulating that, especially for God's moral will for how we live out our Christian faith. And so, not spending time in the Word of God prevents us from being able to understand the will of God for our lives in general. And it also prevents us from being able to know how to reflect on things properly from a Christian worldview as we are presented with different kinds of art, TV, music, short video clips, or whatever the case is. Steve, what are some of your final thoughts on the question about how do we deal with this with, kids or, people in our
Yeah.
churches and whatnot?
Yeah, so I want to first answer Jillian's question. Do we teach the classics? I have to say, yes. I have my Beethoven vinyl box set, okay? And I
Yeah.
have Verdi and Haydn and, Tchaikovsky. Like, as an artist and as a musician, like, yeah, I'm into metal and emo and hardcore and punk rock. But like you said, Scott, like, as a musician, you're always wanting to expand your horizons, and nobody's done music better than than the classics. Like, nobody's going to do something better than Mozart, right? Like, that's just not going to happen. And if you see yourself as a real artist, like, you're going to dig into that stuff. So thank you, Jillian. I support that completely. Please teach our kids the classics, the composers, Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, all of them. From a biblical perspective, I think we specifically, to answer your question, Scott, about how do we approach this and teaching people in the church, there's nothing new under the sun. I think two things are true at the same time. First off, yes, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Yet, like you said, God is a creator and he created us in his image. He created us as creators, right? We're creating on the micro level, right? Not the giant level, but you see that in humanity. We're creators. We're creating art. We're creating buildings. We're creating organizations, right? We're creating philosophies and ideas that are not concrete in the real world. So we are creators. And so how do those two things work together? Well, first off, when we're talking about art, like paintings, you only have three colors, right? You got red, blue, and yellow. That's it. And so there's no new colors. That's what you got to work with. And yet at the same time, amazing pieces of work, right? Jillian, you were just talking about that, going through museums and seeing the beauty of paintings. And we're not going to stop seeing paintings. That's going to keep occurring, right? We're going to see masterpieces still created. When it comes to music, at least Western music, unless you want to talk about like semitones and stuff, that's beyond my pay grade. We have 12 notes and that's it. And yet at the same time, we have the most dynamic pieces of music that have ever been created. And you're creating these huge pieces of works of art that are really only 12 notes. That's all you got to work with, you know? And so I think two things are true. The system God's created, this is it, right? You have the Lego pieces. You're not getting new pieces. And yet, at the same time, it's up to you to build those works of art. And so it's a paradigm thing. How do you want to see it? Do you want to see that this life is meaningless, or do you want to see that, hey, life is actually fleeting, right? That's what that word hevel means in Ecclesiastes. It's fleeting, not nihilistic, but it's here and gone. So how are you going to make the most of it while you're here? How can you utilize the limited things in front of you to bring glory to God, to bring beauty to this world, and to point everything back to Him? Whenever you create a beautiful masterpiece, that brings Him glory because it reveals His creativity in you and in His creation. And so that's how I would explain it. Yeah, on some level, what you got is what you got. But that's not limiting. You know what I mean? It just lets you know the boundaries. Like, this is a Minecraft world that He's given you, and you are free to create whatever within it with all of the stuff He's given you. Now, you could complain that you only have 3 colors, but dude, Picasso had 3 colors, and Go had for 3 colors, and he's made amazing things with it, right? We only have 24 letters in our alphabet, but dude, we've got like works of Shakespeare and Dorothy Sayers. You know what I mean? Like, we have masterpieces with just these limited pieces of information. So I could go on, but I think that really sums up like my heart of the matter. I think there's 2 things. Yeah. We're creators, and like, there's nothing new under the sun, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, this is not original to me, but I've heard this analogy that jazz is like a bunch of people standing on one rug, and they're all playing, but they can move around on that rug anywhere they want. And as long as they're on that rug, it all works together. And the same is true for the way that we create in our world. You know, we're limited with what God has given us, but with what God has given us, we're essentially unlimited in what we can do with it. And so I would argue that, you know, our creativity is finite, but it's still so massive that no one person can ever do it all, right? Well, when it comes to our world and it comes to being in a place of unrest, when it comes to being in a society where politics is dividing people left and right and down the middle and every other which way, when it comes to things happening in the world beyond our borders, it's important for us to recognize, as you mentioned earlier, that God is in control. And even though the world sometimes feels out of control, we can lean into God, we can trust God that He's working things out. He's not, as you guys also mentioned, causing the evil, but He, through evil, can bring about things that are good, right? When Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, and he tells his brothers years down the road, you meant this for evil, but God used it for good. And, you know, we as Christians need to recognize that God's in control, and that no matter what's happening in the world around us, God can use that to eventually, and is using that to eventually bring about His redemptive purposes. And we may not see all the effects of that here and now, but we can rest knowing that in His control, it's going to work out in the right time, even if it's not for, unfortunately, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of years, right? And we find that in Scripture. God's preparing the way of the Messiah. And from Abraham to Christ, that way, it takes 2,100 years for it to happen. And now Christ is preparing to make all things new, and we don't know how long that's going to take. But we know that regardless of how long it takes, He's on His throne in heaven, guiding creation, guiding history now. So, kind of to summarize, no, there's really not anything new in the sense that the same kind of things in our world today have always been around. But in each new generation, there are new experiences and new things that we can take part in or that we can contribute to that allow us to still be creative and use our creativity that God has given us to not only reflect His image, but to share his kingdom with the world around us. And as Christians, we need to be all about sharing God's kingdom with the world, but building bridges to the gospel through our creativity, through the way that we interact with others, the way that we treat each other, the way that we go to our job that seems mundane and is the same thing over and over every day. And as we, talk to the people in our church and our congregations, as we talk to our kids, we help them understand that the things that they do matter. Even if life is fleeting, even if life is short, the things you do have eternal significance. As Christians, that should also bring a little bit of peace in knowing that the things that we do now not only have eternal significance, but that the things that we do can also help draw others into proper fellowship and relationship with God. So, Jillian and Steve, any final comments from you guys today? All right.
Yeah. Thanks for the conversation. As always,
sure.
I feel enlightened by the wisdom of Jillian and Scott. So thank y'all.
Same.
So, well, for those of you guys watching or listening at home, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us on this conversation. And we will see you again next time on the Faith and Culture Now podcast. All right. We have stopped the recording.